Thank you very much. To money management, harvest management, or do I have that wrong?
Larkin was my mentor at UBC when I started there, and I helped him a bit writing a paper called An Epitaph for Maximum Sustained Yield, where he warned fishery scientists about three things. One of them is he warned about slavish adherence to MSY as a management goal, and more particularly slavish belief in the models used to estimate MSY, where those models have a substantial risk of overestimating MSY and leading to overharvest. He also warned about the erosion in stock structure or biodiversity that can occur in a complex system like the Fraser when MSY goals when harvest rates are set at the MSY rates for the larger and more productive stocks. And then thirdly, he warned that there are other goals in management besides just yield. There, in particular, are economic goals. And for example, if we wanted to maximize the profits from our fisheries, we would fish at lower than MSY rates, with the marginal economic gain from taking more fish is exceeded by the costs of taking them at harvest rates below the MSY harvest rates. Larkin did not offer, however, clear recommendations about how to deal with the stock structure and biodiversity issue. He basically sidestepped that. He said we should take care to try not to cause irreversible extinction of small stocks that could become important in the future, but didn't offer specific portfolio management recommendations about how to achieve a balance between yield and diversity.
Well, speaking to that very issue, Dr. Walters, I cross-examined Dr. Holt in these proceedings, and Mr. Lunn will put the transcript before us on December the 7th of last year. And I'm referring to page 55. If you don't have it on your screen, I'll be reading this passage of my question, her response, and I want to elicit from you your response to Dr. Holt's answer to me.
Is that of the? I have that material. What page, please?
It is page 55 of the transcript of that date.
Gotcha.
And I start my question at question 23. Excuse me, at line 23. And if you have that in front of you, it reads, "Now, my first question to you relates to the whole substance of the wild salmon policy and, in particular, the assertion that maintenance of high biodiversity, all CUs, in other words, above their lower benchmarks, is necessary to maintain a fully sustainable fishery for the Fraser sockeye. And I assume you generally subscribe to that approach, do you not?" Dr. Holt answers yes. Question: that being the case, my question to you is this: isn't that fishery largely dependent on a relatively small number of large stocks? Let me start with that question. Do you agree? Dr. Holt's response: that is true for the current period. As Dr. Irvine mentioned a few minutes ago, it is possible that the stock ratios may change over time, so the ones that are dominant now may be small in the future, but other ones that are small now may become dominant in the future. Question, right? Then my question, then Dr. Holt says, so maintaining that diversity is important for the long run. Question, so you speak of Dr. Irvine's comments a few minutes ago about Bristol Bay, do you not? Dr. Holt, yes, that was one example that he gave. And then it goes on from there. I have a couple questions arising out of that testimony. Firstly, do you agree with Dr. Holt?
On which point? That maintaining all stocks is necessary for the future?
Precisely.
No, absolutely not. That's equivalent to your stockbroker telling you that you have to keep every stock you ever owned in your stock portfolio.
Right, and you made mention of that yesterday. If you have nothing more on that particular matter about Bristol Bay, can you, or anyone, or Dr. Riddle?
May I just point out, in fairness to the witness, I think Mr. Rosenblum said maintaining all stocks. I see the evidence to say maintaining diversity.
Maintaining diversity. Yeah. I'm sorry, did I misread the?
Well, I'm looking at line 43 on page, whatever this page is.
Line 43, Dr. Hope. So maintaining that diversity is important for the long run. And I misread that? I'm sorry.
I thought you said all stocks.
Oh, no. Having heard that exchange, that doesn't change your testimony, does it, Dr. Walters?
No, not at all. There is also an assertion in that testimony about small stocks potentially becoming the large stocks, and in particular a reference Cultus Lake being much larger, potentially much larger than it is today. I don't believe that kind of argument is correct. Most of the stocks that are small today, with a few exceptions like the Harrison River, are small because they live in very limited habitats. They do not have the potential to become very large and to replace our big dominant stocks. They don't have that, you can't grow that many fish in those small lakes. The Bristol Bay reference is to a paper by Ray Hilborn where he pointed out that in the Bristol Bay system that has 8 major stocks that contribute to it, the dominance pattern of those stocks has shifted. That's not small stocks becoming important. That is shifting patterns of contribution among large stocks. Another study in Bristol Bay by Daniel Schindler pointed out that when you have a large number of stocks contributing to production, you obtain a portfolio stabilization effect on yield, so one's down, the other's up. The situation that Daniel was referring to is one where there's a very large number of small spawning stocks going up and down, not a few large dominants and many small ones that can't become large. The closest we have to the situation that Schindler referred to in the Fraser is in the early Stewart complex, where there is a large number of small streams that contribute to the production, and some of them haven't done well and others have, and so on. This whole argument, and it speaks to Dr. Larkin's points, we have not resolved the issue of how to select a portfolio for the long term. And it is not just a matter of saving every stock.
Thank you. Again, borrowing Dr. Woody's comments about this experiment that we've experiencing of late in terms of harvest management since 1995 to the present. Dr. Riddell, can you tell me, has there been a retrospective estimate of the yield loss, so I'm speaking of harvest loss, over this period of what I'll call the experiment?
I don't believe there's been any retrospective assessment of loss, no.
And you would agree with me, depending on whether you apply the Richter or Larkin model, that the figures could be very, very significant in terms of financial loss to the harvesters?
Well, I'm sure that you will show a significant number of fish lost to the harvest opportunity. My concern in doing that retrospective is similar to my concern with Carl's response. And I don't know, were you going to come back to the panel?
I'm sorry, I'm happy to. So let's go back to Carl's comment, Dr. Walters' comments, and then allow you to carry on about this retrospective estimate of loss.
Yeah, and Mr. Commissioner, I think the answer is very, very similar to both from my perspective, in the sense I have no question or concern with Carl's comment about many of the small stocks will be small. Their productive capacity is quite limited. But we already noted today that we have these 19 stocks that we are focused on in the production assessment, of which there are actually 38 conservation units, really only looking at production from about half. They are the majority of the production. I think they make up 80 to 90% in most years, but not in the off-cycle years. And so if you were even concerned about potential fishing opportunities, they're certainly concerned about delivery of fish to First Nation communities in the off-cycle years. These small stocks have an aggregate value that can be quite important to local communities. And so I have no problem agreeing that Fraser sockeye salmon in this portfolio issue is not a very equal comparison with Bristol Bay. They just don't have the same sort of capacity to compensate for the magnitude of loss that occurred in Bristol Bay. But I do think that in doing the retrospective and in considering the value of the local, the biodiversity we're referring to in the Fraser, you must look at the full set of management objectives again, including the local values of the smaller lakes to the First Nation communities and to the local ecosystems. So from a strictly economic perspective, I don't have any concern really with what Carl's saying, that the small stocks in the Fraser simply don't have the productive capacity to compensate like they did in Bristol Bay. But I don't think that takes away the value of the maintaining the diversity, just like Dr. Larkin referred to a long time ago. I think that paper was 74? 77. Well, he has another one, Plate Against Salmon 74, which is another sort of paper that everybody should read if you're in salmon biology. But it's just a matter of saying that these small populations are acknowledged to have significant values that are not just economic, and this was very, very strongly expressed by many people advising on the wild salmon policy. But the real art of this, and I think the concern that we need to get to in resolving this issue with biodiversity versus opportunities for harvest, is Carl's analysis recently suggesting some of the small populations are getting increasingly unproductive. Now that is a critical issue we'd have to investigate, because that could be a significant limitation on how we can conserve these populations.
All right, before we go back to you, Dr. Riddell, on the issue of estimates of yield loss from making these decisions from this grand experiment, Dr. Walters, do you have anything to respond to Dr. Riddell in respect to the issue of small stock?
No.
Thank you.
There certainly, DFO recognizes values of the small stocks associated with First Nations use and so on.
Thank you.
That's a public policy issue beyond the scope of my competence as a biologist.
Thank you. Dr. Riddell, back to you on the question of stock value, or as I put it, yield lost to harvest. You don't believe that work has been done, correct? To the best of your knowledge.
I'm not aware that it has been done.
And does it not strike you that it's critical in the application of the wild salmon policy that socioeconomic analysis is done on a constant basis before decisions are made or would be made under the wild salmon policy?
Well,
isn't that part of the policy?
Yeah, the policy recognizes, I was just going to say, the policy recognizes the need to do that. Outside of the policy, though, I mean, we're referring to the rebuilding objective as an experiment, and it is unfortunate that the experiment hasn't been fully assessed in that perspective, and as Carl's talking about the adaptive management approach and where we go in the future, it's probably a good time to do that before you start designing another approach for the next 10 years. But to my knowledge, that retrospective has not been conducted.
Thank you. Dr. Walters, do you have any comment to make on this very question of retrospective estimate of yield loss to my clients and other harvesters from this so-called experiment?
Yes. As the Scientific Advisory Committee was being disbanded for the Cohen Commission, I contacted Dave Levy and recommended very strongly that such a retrospective analysis be carried out as part of the Commission's work. I recommended it be an add-on to Randall Peterman's work, or the contract with Steve Martell. Martell and I had done a similar analysis on earlier data from the Fraser. I also contacted Jeff Grout from DFO and recommended that they do that, and I sent a spreadsheet with the beginnings of a retrospective analysis to Al Cass with a request that DFO's Frizzy team used the big Frizzy model to carry out such an analysis. There's been no response to the request of the DFO people, and the commission, I don't know what the commission decided to do about it. I believe there is a study that is going to attempt something like that.
And
I carried out a retrospective spreadsheet analysis for the 1995 to 2009 period and looking forward for about 8 years. And using the model, that retrospective analysis showed that the total loss in value from harvesting, if the Larkin type models are correct, has been about $200 million, not including the loss from 2010, which would be another probably $40 million. So it appears that to me that the economic losses were very substantial.
when you refer to the commission, for example, in reference to phoning or contacting Dr. Levy, you're of course referring to this commission as opposed to the Pacific Salmon Commission.
That's right.
Thank you.
Right.
Sorry, did you have something to say, Dr. Walters?
Now, the way this retrospective analysis is done is we build a multi-stock. I use 10-stock population model using the Ricker and Larkin equations. And we provide that model with the actual historical recruitment anomalies that occurred over the years. We provide it with the pre-spawning mortality patterns that occurred, so that if we give that model the historical harvest rates by timing group, it gives us back exactly the observed historical catches. And then what we do is to vary the harvest rates away from those that actually occurred, and then ask what if we had harvested at higher rates or lower rates. I explored two options. One of them was a steady 60% harvest rate through the 1995 to 2009 period. In other words, follow basically the TAM rule but ignore pre-spawning mortality. And a second scenario with a 70% harvest rate. And the estimate of $200 million worth of fish lost comes from that higher harvest rate of 70%, which is about what the Larkin models indicate overall is the best for the Fraser. I did not make adjustments, as one should, for the very low returns in 2007, 8, and 9, which would have reduced the losses a little bit if I did. I just said, suppose we just ignored all of the complications that have occurred and just steadily.
Excuse me, Dr. Walters. Mr. Leadham wishes to interject.
For the record, Leadham, initial T for the Conservation Coalition. Dr. Walters is obviously referring to some work that he's done that's not before the Commission, and he's given some oral testimony about it, but I think it would be helpful if we were to see the work of Dr. Walters at some stage and be able to offer some commentary on it and perhaps have him come back to answer some questions about this. It certainly takes me a little bit by surprise.
I'm in the hands of the Commission.
It's a pity that it does take you by surprise. It's a pity that there has not been a follow-up on the recommendations to do this and to get it before the Commission, particularly by DFO staff using their more complete data sets and so on. The spreadsheets that I used, or at least an early version of them, I believe you actually do have, but they were listed among the exhibits for this meeting, for this panel. There are a couple of Excel spreadsheets that were early versions of the calculations, the versions that I sent to Jeff Grout, I think are listed amongst your exhibits. But you would have to be an expert in population dynamics and spreadsheet techniques in order to make any sense of those. They are not documented.
Don, could I comment?
Quick analysis I did to test the feasibility of doing it and to so that I could recommend clearly that it be done.
Thank you. Dr. Riddell wishes to speak.
Just a simple comment, pretty much to the comment that Tim just made, in the sense that, as Carl's inferring, this will be a very technical assessment. The standard procedure would be to have this go through a technical review, a scientific review, so that when it comes before the commission, you have confidence in the analysis and its supports, or we all agree on what is presented. Now, there are obviously a number of critical assumptions Carl's would have to make in terms of meeting these multiple objectives. And that, so, I mean, I think there's a couple of steps here, and that I had heard of this work in the background, but I've not had any opportunity to review this sort of material. Yes, it would have been nice to have the commission have it as a piece of work for the future, and that, but I think realistically right now, this is going to be highly technical, as Carl's just referred to, and it would be probably a greater service to the commission if you had people review this with Carl and maybe submit a report to you later on this. It's not something that's easily discussed without seeing the documentation.
Well, we leave that with the commission. It's obviously out of our hands as council, but you have heard Dr. Walters' plea for this work to be done by the commission, and that he previously made such a request. Unless there are further comments in that regard, I come to my last area, which, quite frankly...
Excuse me, Don, before you go on, I do have one additional comment.
Right.
I don't particularly see this as something the commission should be doing. I see it as a fundamental responsibility of the Frizzy team and of DFO to be looking retrospectively at their management performance, to be asking how they could improve that performance. And I'm frankly a bit shocked that it was not part of the Frizzy process. That kind of careful retrospective analysis wasn't part of the Frizzy process in general.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walters. I now come to the last area of my examination, which frankly I consider probably the most important in terms of long-term sustainability of the resource, and it relates to the budget issues of DFO. And Dr. Riddell, you have spoken about this during previous appearances before this commission. Discussion was had briefly yesterday by the panel about research that was necessary. In fact, I believe Dr. Riddell, if I got your words down correctly, I don't have it from the transcript, you spoke about the information system going in the wrong direction right now. You did use the term wrong direction. I wish to put before you a series of questions and answers that I had with the Deputy Minister, Ms. Dansereau, before these very proceedings, where I raised the whole question of DFO budgeting and raised the question of the 5% reduction in the upcoming budget as she's being ordered by Treasury Board to reduce by that 5%. Dr. Riddell, to put this in context, you did testify a few days ago, and please correct me if I've misstated your evidence, that 5% reduction, as you understand it, really is very, very significant and much more than 5%, because DFO does not apply the 5% to the salary portion of DFO's operations, which is around 70% of their total budget. The 5% gets hit from the operating expenses of the remaining 30%. Is that your testimony a previous day?
Very similar to it. Frequently when you get a budget reduction, the 5% I know, and I should qualify, of course, that I am not in the department in the last 2 years when these 5% have been applied. But the statement I've heard about the 5% is that it's across total budget. That then includes, as I described, your capital, your salaries and wages, your operating funds. And that the only salary dollars that could be reducted would be salary dollars that are vacant positions. And typically we don't leave those salary dollars vacant. All right, they would be used elsewhere. But when I left the stock assessment department, as an example, we had pretty well 75% of our budget in salaries. And so you can do the math very simply. And that, so a 5% across total multiplies substantially up by about, well, threefold minimum. And so that you then have to apply that across your operating budgets, depending on how it's actually applied to different programs.
All right.
The 5% hits the department. How it's transferred to the actual regions could differ. All right, it's possible some areas could have none, some could have 10. and that's at the discretion of the Department of Fisheries in Ottawa. When it hits the region, there's another decision process involved of how it's actually assigned to particular programs.
Thank you. Now, we've heard testimony throughout these many months of a clarion plea for research to be done in various areas that up till now has not been considered or carried out by DFO. I want to put Ms. Dansereau's evidence before you. I want your response, and quite frankly, Ms. Dansereau's coming back at the end of this, the concluding days of this inquiry, and I intend to probably put your responses back to her. She said, and I'm referring to transcript of November the 2nd of last year, I'm referring to page 63, and Dr. Walters, you do not need this to be before you, I don't believe. At page 63, line 12, where we were speaking of this 5% reduction as directed from Treasury Board, line 12, question, well, the fact is there's going to be a 5% cut is obviously consequential to all stakeholders in respect to this industry, isn't it? She replied, I would say, well, it could be. It depends on, we hope we've done a significantly good enough job to make sure that there is not that much pain felt. Question, well, this is an awfully general question to you, Ms. Dansereau, but would you agree with me, or let me ask you this, are all science programs, departments, projects, stock assessment, stream enumerations, etc., adequately funded up till now, in your opinion, during the time of your tenure? And her response was, I would say yes. But I'm sure if we spoke to others at a greater, more directly connected to each of the activities, they would probably prefer to have more money. Question, and you'd probably agree with me that within your department there would be controversy and there'd be those that didn't agree with you on that question. Ms. Dansereau, always. Maybe start with you, Dr. Riddell. This appears to be the thinking of the senior people within DFO in the context of facing down a 5% reduction in the upcoming year, and obviously having experienced previous reductions as you spoke about them. What is your response to the mindset of the senior people within DFO that they believe that the budget as currently before them and currently about to be cut is adequate to meet the very critical matters that you have previously testified to in terms of research?
Well, thank you for that loaded question. Well, I don't think there's any question that I disagree. I'm not surprised at all at her reply because, of course, these people are under significant pressure for national priorities, and I'm sure there's very substantial debate in Ottawa where the money goes to various departments. But I don't think there's any question that you would get a very common response on the West Coast with respect to salmon stock assessment, that it's, I have said publicly here, I believe, that it's definitely at a marginal responsible level, that, the sort of what we would define as a core stock assessment responsibility is barely being met now. And that, I suppose the irony of this is that I've also told you that there's always a direction to ensure that Fraser Sockeye assessment is met. Now we've heard that there's a couple of exceptions to that, and so the funds that come here.
Excuse me, at great expense to other stock.
Thank you. I was just about to point out that what happens is the money on a limited budget goes to the Fraser Sockeye first, and there are other salmon species in the Fraser that are not sufficiently funded. And then outside the Fraser, in years where the money is tight, definitely takes a major reduction in order to meet the requirements of the Fraser Sockeye. And as I point out again, we are not even doing assessments of Fraser pink salmon. So to say that we're meeting a minimum core is simply not accurate. But in all honesty, how would you know what sort of advice is getting up to that level? She may well believe that's true because that's what she's told. I think that it would be a matter of record of simply looking at the history of the stock assessment programs that they are not being funded adequately.
Well, you speak of competing interests of all departments at Treasury Board level. You would agree with me the responsibility of the senior managers of DFO is to fight out their cause at Treasury Board to ensure that they get their appropriate portion of the national budget.
I can say in all honesty that the people that I've personally known in Ottawa that are responsible for that try very hard. But you get down to national priorities. Fishing on the East Coast gets a certain priority. Fishing on the West Coast may not be as much. And that Arctic is, of course, now getting a significant priority. And that, so these sort of challenges change over time. And we have significant funding challenges within the department because we now have Coast Guard and ships. And anyone reading the paper knows that there's a significant investment going into ships in the near future.
Well, when you say from the people that you knew at very senior level that they tried very hard, would you not agree with me that this deputy minister's testimony before this inquiry, giving this testimony under oath before a royal commission, isn't trying very hard to fight the good fight at Treasury Board to get the necessary money?
Well, I don't think I can comment on that. I mean, I think you can draw your own conclusion from her comment, and that it's not a reflection of necessarily how hard she's trying, but if she's been given a budget and she believes that you've allocated within that budget, these budgets are very large at a departmental level. I mean, there is discretion about where you send money within that department, right? And so there are many levels of decision involved, and before it gets down to the Pacific salmon on the West Coast.
Before I stand down, I wonder if any of the other panelists have any response to the testimony that the Deputy Minister gave in these proceedings. Dr. Walters? I'm sorry, you don't. Do either of the other two panelists?
No.
Hearing nothing, I thank you very much, gentlemen, for answering my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Mr. Eidsvik is next for the Southern Area Eagle Netters and BC Fisheries Survival Coalition.
Philip Eidsvik on the record for the Erie Gill Netters Association and the BC Fisheries Survival Coalition. I want to start off with a couple of general questions, and it kind of goes to the key of science for me. I know doctors have kind of a do no harm principle, and we've talked a lot about the great experiment, and I'm trying to understand the scientific process because I'm a fisherman. I'm not that smart about this stuff, and it's a bit intimidating to be here with the gods of fisheries science on the Fraser. With respect to the experiment that we did on the Fraser River, Dr. Woody, perhaps you can answer. Fraser River is one of the biggest sockeye systems in the world, is that correct?
Mr. Commissioner, the Fraser sockeye as a composite stock grouping would only be second to the Bristol Bay stock grouping.
And at the time the experiment was done, you were probably aware that there were tens of thousands of fishermen, large processing plants, Aboriginal groups fishing it for food, a smaller recreational fishery, but still a recreational fishery. So the stakes on how the experiment turned out were fairly high. Is that fair to say?
Mr. Chairman, or Mr. Commissioner, the term experiment perhaps was not the best. It's an inadvertent result of a policy that was initiated by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in order to provide for conservation of late-run sockeye, which were coming upstream in at a much earlier time and consequently dying en route. And in order to address that issue, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans reduced the harvest rate depending upon the year, and those harvest rates on late-run sockeye only, that's where they were applied, were in some years as low as 13 to 15%, and other years 30% or higher, but considerably lower than the historical harvest rates. What was difficult about that application was that the majority of the catch was allowed to be taken in the outside marine area fisheries, and at times by the time the regulation to open the Fraser River for fishing at a later date arrived, that harvest of late run fish had been taken, and so any fish that then entered the Fraser was allowed to migrate upstream. Both late run fish, early migrating late run fish, and the co-migrating summer run fish. And it's the summer run fish that became the experiment under my terminology. That is, escapement levels of particularly Quesnel sockeye in 2001 and 2002 were very large, and thus the experiment has shown, again, quote unquote experiment, has shown that the over-escapement, or that I term over-escapement, has resulted in disastrous results for the Quesnel sockeye run.
That helps. I was going to get into that a bit later, but we're here now. Call this problem, I think you call it the elephant in the room.
Well, the late run sockeye, yes, is the elephant in the room, because not only are we seeing a reduction of the productivity of Quesnel sockeye as a result of the management decisions on the basis of late run sockeye, but also we're seeing, of course, decreased abundance of several of the late run stocks, which are subject to this pre-spawning mortality. Cultus, weaver, and some of the other stocks. Fortunately, the large late Shuswap stocks, Adams River and lower Shuswap River, and associated stocks, have been migrating at a later time. A lower fraction of their run has come up during the summer, and subsequently has not have not had excessively high mortalities. So their strength has been maintained, their population sizes, and in fact in 2010 the late Shuswap stocks have, I believe, come up close to the record level of abundance.
Now, did you give advice to DFO on how to deal with this problem back when it was being discussed and we were first aware of this early entry issue?
I gave advice to the Fraser River panel in 2001 in the planning phase. We had been given the expected returns, forecast returns, and then based on the experience of the timing of late run sockeye in 2000, we estimated what I think my recall isn't precise, but I believe that we essentially assumed that their migration would be early in 2001 again. And in the modeling, and this is a simulation modeling of fisheries that the Pacific Salmon Commission uses to assist the Fraser River panel in managing the sockeye resource, that those simulation models indicated that a large fraction of the summer run fish would escape to the spawning grounds. That was the dominant year of the Quesnel runs, and therefore a very large excess escapement was forecast to occur, and other summer runs as well. So our approach, that is Pacific Salmon Commission staff approach, was to, because we knew that from experience that these late run fish in the river, migrating in the river in August, had very low successive expectation of survival, that fishing should occur in the Fraser River to harvest primarily the surplus summer run fish that were being allowed to go upstream, or would be allowed to go upstream, if the fishery was closed. And it wasn't the targeting of the late runs to catch those fish. It was to allow the summer runs to escape at more MSY levels as opposed to the expected surpluses that would be anticipated.
What did you expect the mortality of those early entry fish would be? Are we talking 10%? Were you expected to die? 50%? 90%? Can you help us on that?
The expectation, I don't recall specifically, but the experience that we had in 2000 was that very roughly 95% of the late run fish in that year migrated upstream in August, and we made a calculation that the en route mortality based on the numbers of fish that were estimated to have passed the Mission hydroacoustic site and the numbers that reached the spawning grounds in the particularly Weaver Creek that year, less the pre-spawning mortality of the fish that did reach the spawning ground. The mortality prior to spawning was about 95%. In other words, only 5% of those fish did survive. And my recommendation was that we could probably fish in the Fraser River until about August 25th without having a major impact on the numbers of late run fish that would survive to spawn. And that would have allowed fisheries to capture primarily the summer run fish, which were excess to escapement requirements. That recommendation was not adopted. Some of the things that would have been difficult to work with were that Canada had gear allocation requirements where each gear type, seines and Area B seines, Area D gill nets, G and H troll, and so on, outside marine area fisheries would not get a share of this catch of surplus fish in the Fraser River unless there was some mechanism developed to attain it. It was primarily to take those surplus fish. I'm not the one to decide or determine how Canada allocated its catch, but the harvest of some of those excess fish would have been very desirable from my point of view, and would have, if it had been adopted, perhaps mediated the decline in the Quesnel stock, and if it had been adopted and used as a policy subsequently.
So I think if I understand you correctly, then there's the early entry late run fish were coming in over a period of about 30 days, and the fish at the early part of that were more likely to die than the fish at the later part of the run. I got that correct?
Yes, that's correct. I mentioned yesterday that the Fraser sockeye, on average, most stocks don't reside in fresh water for more than about 6-7 weeks. And in fact, late run stocks, on average, reside in fresh water more in the order of 3 to 4 weeks. And by in year 2000, Weaver sockeye migrated upstream 7 weeks early. So those that were coming in during August, in my estimation, were those that principally were mortality. The question of mortality versus timing was addressed by radio tagging on the Adams River sockeye in year 2000, 2003, and 2006. And the results of that those tagging records and subsequent tracking resulted in essentially showing that a very high proportion of sockeye that migrated into the Fraser River before about August 20th, on average, died en route. What was missing in the radio tagging was the assessment of pre-spawning mortalities once they got to the spawning grounds. DFO through Timber Whitehouse, stock assessment biologist for the Fraser River, tagging at Ashcroft with disc tags showed that in fact the earliest component of the run had survival of down in the 1% range. So there was a good deal of information that gave evidence that the fish that, late run fish that migrate into the river during August, at least to 20th, 25th of August, have relatively low success of survival and spawning.
Okay, so if I understand...
Mr. Isaac, I'm sorry, I know the time, so perhaps we can take a break.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Hearing is now adjourned until 2 o'clock.